Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, no April Fool's joke today. Hope you guys really enjoyed that one yesterday. This was a channel and a video that was recommended to me in the last couple of days, and I've often talked about how we can see history differently when we look at it through different lenses. Same events, same happenings, same people, but looked at from a particular point of view can sometimes reveal things maybe we didn't see before. And that's the case here. This is a channel called Casual Economics. I have long confessed that I don't have a lot of knowledge when it comes to the financial and economic aspect of history. So I'm looking forward to learning some things here. But this is the Great Depression in 12 minutes. I think a lot of us have a casual understanding of the Great Depression. This will be a good background for us because I think most people say, well, stock market crash led to the Great Depression. Well, as is true with all of history, there are connecting events and there are things that lead into events that we often point to. So I'll put the link down in the description so you can check out all of their content, not just this particular video. Let's dive into this one.
The Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in modern history. People went from parties, jazz music, and riches in the roaring 20s to losing their life savings and standing in bread lines in the span of a few years.
And it's important to note that before what we now call the Great Depression, there had been one in the late 18th or 19th century that was called the Great Depression. And many of the people who lived through that one were still alive, were in their later years when this Great Depression came about.
And the Depression wasn't just in America.
Yeah.
Its impact spread across the world and ultimately led to the start of World War II. But what exactly caused the Depression? And what lessons can we learn from it? Let's start in 1918. World War I has just ended, and American soldiers are returning home having won the war.
And bringing with them the same Spanish flu that they had actually taken to the Western Front. As far as we know, the flu, one of the first instances of it is in Kansas in the United States. Soldiers who are training then take it to the Western Front. They give it to all their soldiers. Then the war ends and everybody takes it home. And so 1919 was a pretty nasty year for all of that.
It feels good to be back. During the war, women had for the first time begun to enter the workforce. And with men returning now, the economy saw a post-war boom. This economic boom, alongside a growing culture change, created the era known as the Roaring Twenties. Party! At this time in Detroit, Michigan, a man named Henry Ford would revolutionize transportation with the Ford Model T car. Facing huge demand for the car, his company introduced the process of the moving assembly line. This mass production dropped the car's price from $780 in 1910 to $290 in 1924.
And we've seen similar product price drops in our own lifetime, right? There's a big difference between when a product is invented or introduced and when it's made affordable and accessible to large numbers of people. Flat screen TVs have been around for a lot longer than people have been having them in their homes. They've just become affordable. There was a time when I was a teenager when, yes, you could get a computer for your house, but it was super expensive, and so very few people had it. Now it's affordable. That's going to be true with all kinds of products.
Making it the first inexpensive car for the masses. By 1927, the 15 millionth Model T would roll out of the factory. You get a car. You get a car. Everyone gets a car. Many companies would copy this assembly line process to mass produce other inventions, including the radio.
And let's point out, too, that Henry Ford didn't invent the assembly line. He just was the first one to really take advantage of it on a massive scale. And so, yeah, now everything. And here's what happens with this, and we're seeing this in our own lives. Things that once were considered a luxury for one generation, because they become affordable and start to be mass-produced on a grand scale, they become necessities. Whereas for me as a kid, having a computer was a luxury item. Even when I was really little, having a microwave was a luxury item. I remember when we got our first microwave, I was like 8 years old. Now everybody has a microwave. Now everybody has a computer, sometimes multiple computers in their house. those things that were once luxuries are now necessities, and all of these things are going to start becoming necessities in homes.
Washing machine and vacuum. With mass production of new products and improved advertising using the radio, the age of consumerism had officially begun. Everyone wanted the latest and greatest new product. To help with the demand, banks began giving out loans more freely to people so that they could buy these new products on credit with money they didn't yet have. Times were good. People were partying, there was jazz music, and a spirit of social liberation. Good to see you at the party, old sport. Prohibition had started in 1920, but meant little to this new generation. The parties were bigger, the morals were looser, and Wall Street became the place to be. From 1921 to 1929, the US stock market increased sixfold.
Wow.
Driven by the post-war boom, easy credit, and all the demand for new consumer products. As the public learned about these incredible returns from the stock market, everyone began putting money in and talking about it more. This created a snowball effect, where as the stock market continued to go up, people began to blindly sink all their savings into stocks, and some even took out loans, which further drove prices up. When people believe no price is too high for a stock, that can be a warning sign that the price is no longer based on fundamentals, and may have...
All right, this makes a lot of sense to me. It's built on a very flimsy foundation, which means all it takes is one little thing to knock out one of your cards at the bottom, and the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. Makes sense.
Been driven up to irrational levels. Although stock prices were reaching new highs, something wasn't right. By the mid-1920s, the economy and demand for products had slowed drastically. With Europe still recovering from the aftermath of World War I, and few countries being able to afford the new consumer items, global trade was stalling. This didn't matter as people were still overwhelmingly optimistic and expected the stock market would continue to see record yearly performances.
If you're borrowing money, you have to pay that money back at an interest, but you're expecting to offset all the money you're borrowing from the banks by the great returns you're going to get from the stock market. Well, if you're not getting X, then you can't pay Y.
Each year, extreme greed and unrealistic fantasy filled the air. With margin, people could even buy stocks for only 40 to 10% of the actual stock price, and then pay off their loan when the stock sold for large profits. I would like to take out a loan. Sure, what for? A house, a business, a farm? To buy stocks. Fine by me, here you go. By 1929, 40% of US consumer debt was being used to purchase stocks.
That's
and in
nuts.
that same year, the US had just elected a new president, Herbert Hoover, who famously said, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us." To many people, a skyrocketing stock market was a sign of a healthy, booming economy. But things were
And that's true to this day. I mean, people look at the stock market as one of the indicators about whether or not the economy's doing well, whether or not a president is successful. Oh, look at what the stock market did while he was president. When there's so many other factors involved that I know I don't understand.
to take a dark turn. Catastrophe would hit. On October the 24th, 1929, a day that became known as Black Thursday,
yeah.
the stock market would see heavy liquidation, with a record 12.9 million shares sold, and the entire stock market fell 11%. This day marked the beginning of the Great Depression, and the following week there would be Black Tuesday, where the market fell 12%, with a record-breaking 16.4 million shares sold. Eventually, in the span of 2 weeks, stocks had lost about a third of their value. People who had borrowed money to invest were crushed, and many people lost their life savings. However, the worst was yet to come. The common belief is that the stock market crash caused the Great Depression, but this is not entirely true.
It was a symptom of the sickness, not the sickness itself.
The stock market triggered a recession, But the real cause of the Great Depression was that many banks had extended too many bad loans and were speculating too much.
Yeah.
At this time,
So banks are doing the same thing that the people are. People are borrowing money to just pour blindly into stocks, figuring that they're going to get a great return that they can pay off the loan with. And banks are doing the same thing. They're making a killing just throwing money out like candy, money they don't have, because they don't have, if they give out a bunch of loans, they're expecting to get payment back, and that's how they're funding other things that they're doing. Well, if the money's not coming in, then the money can't go back out. It's a domino effect.
many US banks were small and independent shops that lent out a large amount of their assets to people for stock market speculation. As the stock market crashed, these banks went out of business overnight. There was no deposit insurance at the time, so if a local bank closed its doors, people lost their money. With headlines of many banks shutting down, people began to panic and pull
And this is why now you have things like the FDIC, which will guarantee a certain amount of your money. That's meant intentionally to avoid this kind of thing from happening again.
their savings from healthy banks. This created bank runs on otherwise healthy banks that had to turn around and try to get all their customers' money all at once.
You see this played out in the movie It's a Wonderful Life. You see a run on the banks happen. And on a savings and loan, and that's kind of one of the fundamental turning points of that movie is what happens with all of that.
This became a serious problem when in New York City, a false rumor started that the Bank of the United States refused to sell a man's stock. This was enough to cause over 25,000 people to crowd the bank, and by the end of the day, $3 million had been withdrawn from the bank. Fear was in the air, and worried of a larger bank run they couldn't handle, the Bank of the United States closed its doors and asked them.
Fear is a devastating infection that can spread and spread rapidly.
The state to take over the bank's assets. Soon after, the bank failed to get support for a short-term loan to stop the bank run and would ultimately close its doors for good. It accounted for a third of the total $550 million deposits lost in the Depression. This sent shockwaves across the banking industry, and many banks began to call in loans and sell assets in order to stay liquid. 1/3 of banks in America would ultimately fail in this time period. Hey Joe, I just sold my...
And you remember not too many years ago, I think it was right at the end of George W. Bush's second term into the beginning of Barack Obama's first term, you heard this phrase, too big to fail. There was all this government money going out to these big companies and to banks because they were afraid of what happened if any of these financial institutions failed, if it would lead to something like this.
my car and have a few bucks now to pay you back. Which bank are you with again?
Are you crazy? Not a chance I'm leaving my money in any of those banks again.
With people choosing to hold their money outside of banks, the money supply in the US declined 31% from 1929 to 1933. And deflation has devastating effects on an economy. By causing the value of money to go up, it reduces consumers' willingness to spend money, discourages investment, and increases the burden for those in debt. All of this leads to wages and income falling. And through this all, the Federal Reserve stood back, allowing this money supply contraction and the banking failures to happen without any intervention. A crucial mistake.
That's because it was started under a Woodrow Wilson. Why would anything good happen when this guy was president? This guy.
Widely criticized for making the Depression much worse than it needed to be. Through all of this, US President Herbert Hoover had no idea how to fix this and would largely be blamed for the lasting duration of the Depression.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment of it, is that it's not Herbert Hoover's fault that the Depression happened. But, some presidents, it's not that they actively cause a problem, but they're ill-equipped or just don't act in such a way to mitigate the damage of it. And I think if we're going to criticize Hoover for anything, it's going to be that the choices he did make or the things he chose not to do made it worse.
Following the initial stock market crash, there was a growing sentiment for isolationist and protectionist policies. In 1930, he passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act to protect US farmers and other industries from foreign competitors. It increased tariffs on foreign imports to the US by about 20%, which then immediately led to 25 countries retaliating and putting their own tariffs on American goods.
Whew! What do we say all the time? History. History doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And boy, that one hits a little close to home right now, doesn't it?
Global trade would plummet even further from this, declining 66% worldwide from 1929 to 1934. Global trade was a relatively small piece of the American economy at the time, but this policy only made things worse. In total, the Great Depression would last over 10 years and mark the worst economic downturn in the history of the modern world. The Dow Jones would fall 90% from its high in 1929, and many lost their jobs as companies shut down en masse. 9 million savings accounts were wiped out. Over 9,000 US banks had failed. Industry halted, and unemployment in the US reached 24.9%, its highest point in history. To make matters worse, there was a period of severe dust storms in the middle of the US that caused a drought, high winds, and hurt many farms in what became...
See, this is why I get so critical of people today who say, well, you know, especially I hear it a lot from like 20-somethings. Oh, our generation has it worse than any generation before it. Listen, folks, if you were born in 1895, by the time you hit the age of 50, you had lived through World War I, a pandemic that killed maybe 5% of the entire world's population, this depression, and then World War II. Come on. You ain't seen nothing compared to what those people went through.
Became known as the Dust Bowl, the worst man-made ecological disaster in American history. As farming in the US slowed down, and with one-third of Americans still in agriculture, this would have massive consequences. Homelessness and breadlines became a common sight. In America, there would be 34 million people without any income. Shantytowns began appearing across the country.
And this is at a time when the American population was about, I don't know, a third to a half of what it is now. So, I mean, 34 million people out of work now would be a disaster. That would be 10% of our population. At that time, it was so much worse.
And got the nickname Hoovervilles after the now disgraced president. Could it get any worse? In 1932, the US elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who promised drastic changes and action to get the country out of the Depression. With the New Deal program, for helping the needy, he established a minimum wage, overtime pay, unemployment insurance, and a social security program.
Now listen, if you're conservative like I am, you're probably predisposed to oppose any kind of like massive government intervention in things like this. And it's a favorite of conservatives to go after the New Deal. But you have to understand, at this time and place with what was happening, sometimes the government has to step in. They just do. And that's why I say it all the time. Yes, I have my conservative principles, but there are times when there are extraordinary events that sometimes you have to lay aside your principles and you have to lay aside what you think is best in most situations, because this is an extraordinary situation. The same thing is true for so many other times in history with so many other examples, whether it be certain laws that get passed or government interventions. I'm not trying to start a political debate, but at this time and place, this is what people wanted. People wanted the government to do something, and to do something drastic.
As for major banking reforms, he enacted federal deposit insurance on bank deposits to help prevent bank runs. And he also added the Securities and Exchange Commission for better reporting and scrutiny on public companies. FDR's New Deal programs helped to stabilize the banking industry and restore the public's confidence. However, it would still take several years for the US economy to fully bounce back. With other countries around the world having also suffered from the Great Depression, this led to the rise of extremist governments, and World War II would begin just a few years later in 1939. It wasn't until the start of World War II in 1939 that the Great Depression truly ended. It was only at this time that the unemployment rate fell below 10%, and the US saw vast stimulus to support war efforts. Economists still argue how much intervention is needed to solve an economic disaster and the effect of the New Deal program.
Right, because you could look at what happened, like I referred to earlier at the end of Bush's second term, and say, was that government intervention really necessary? Well, we don't know. It's hard to say because it happened. And a lot of people were opposed to it, and I myself was opposed to a lot of the government intervention in that case. I can see why it was needed in 1932, 33, 34. Not sure it was needed other times, but that's for people far smarter than I am when it comes to economics to debate.
Many of the lessons learned from the Great Depression are still used in the modern day, including the need for a small, stable amount of inflation to boost consumer spending and business investment, an increased role in government spending, and the assistance from the government to boost the economy when a recession occurs. By learning from the past, we can better understand our current economic system and see any potential dangerous parallels in the future. In the end, it was greed that drove people to believe that there was no price too high for a stock and made many banks take on bad loans. And just like all bubbles, an overinflated market always sees the same ending of a painful crash.
All right, that was really good, and I learned some things I definitely did not know. I mean, I knew some of that stuff, but maybe not the details. So what about you? Some of you, this is like your bread and butter. This is a topic you're well-versed in. Let us know in the comment section below. Let's discuss. Let's learn together. Thanks for watching.